Good afternoon, and welcome to the API webinar, New API CK-4 and FA-4 Diesel Engine Oil Specifications Are Coming, and Why You Need to Know About Them Before December. I'm Becky Burrows, Director of Recognition and Specialty Events with Randall Riley, and it is our pleasure to have you all in on what is sure to be an informative session. We will hear from Kevin Farrick with API this morning discussing why new engine oil specifications are needed for heavy-duty diesel engines, new emissions regulations, and how lower viscosity oils help improve fuel economy. When the American Petroleum Institute, API, announced that it had approved its latest diesel engine oil standards, API service categories CK-4 and FA-4, it marked a significant milestone in the development of diesel engine oils. API had developed two new standards rather than one to meet new emissions and fuel efficiency regulations and provide improved protection for current and future diesel engines. These new service categories, which become effective on December 1st, 2016, improve upon existing API standards by providing enhanced protection against oil oxidation and protection against engine wear, particulate filter blocking, piston deposits, and degradation of low and high temperature properties. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few things that will help you get the most out of this webinar. To get a full view of the presentation, click the arrows on the Grab tab on the top left of your control panel to minimize the panel. This will place the tab on the top right of your screen and will enable you to see the entire presentation. We would also like to encourage questions. To ask a question, bring your control panel back by clicking the double arrows and type your question in the box that says Enter a Question for the staff. We will answer these at the end of the webinar. Thank you for attending today, and please remember to ask your questions as they arise. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker. Kevin Farrick currently manages API's Engine Oil Licensing and Certification System, a voluntary licensing program designed to define, certify, and monitor engine oil performance. The program's marks, the service symbol donut and certification mark starburst, help consumers identify quality engine oils for their gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles. Mr. Farrick also manages API's Diesel Exhaust Fluid Certification and Motor Oil Matters programs. Mr. Farrick became the Engine Oil Program Manager in March 1998. His duties include the management of the API Lubricants Group and its work groups and task forces. Kevin, we welcome you today. I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Becky, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate all of your help and support and Randall Riley's support in helping us host this webinar. It is a pleasure for me to be able to speak to this audience and to try to provide as much information as I can in a short amount of time on the new API CK-4 and FA-4 diesel engine oil standards. With that in mind, let's kind of move right ahead and start moving and talking about the new categories. I always like to start by making sure people understand what the American Petroleum Institute is, and hopefully for them to understand our role in setting standards for gasoline and diesel engine oils. The American Petroleum Institute is, as the slide shows in front of you, the only national trade association that represents all aspects of America's oil and natural gas industry. Our 650 corporate members, from the largest major oil company to the smallest of independents, come from all segments of the industry. They are producers, refiners, suppliers, marketers, pipeline operators, and marine transporters, as well as service and supply companies that support all segments of the industry. To go a little bit more in explaining API and its role, we achieve our mission through our range of programs. One of the things we do is advocacy, but we also do research and statistics, standard setting, which we'll talk a bit about, and certification. From an API perspective, advocacy is a very important, one of our very important roles that we play, but we also play the standards and certification setting is also a key component of the American Petroleum Institute's mission. We currently manage something in the neighborhood of more than 600 industry standards and we run a variety of certification programs. When it comes to standard setting, as I said, API is a standard setting organization, and that includes engine oils. And in fact, API has been setting engine oil standards for almost 70 years. The first API engine oil standards were introduced in 1947, and we have been modifying and updating them ever since. There are three key standards that API maintains related to engine oils. API 1509, the Engine Oil Licensing and Certification System. That long-winded title is the best way to describe it is that is the API Engine Oil Standard Bible. That is where we explain the API engine oil programs, the engine oil standards, the API engine oil marks, and the requirements necessary for engine oil marketers to become licensed under the API engine oil program and against the API performance standards. API 1525 and 1525A are both related to bulk oil handling and chain of custody requirements. Essentially, it has to do with how bulk oils are handled and how they're identified in the marketplace. Now, as part of the program, API has been setting standards for, as I said, almost 70 years. And then for more than 20 years, we've been licensing oils against the API standards. And for more than 20 years, we've been auditing these licensed and unlicensed oils, or we've been testing them in the marketplace. So as I said earlier, part of API's mission is to establish and maintain standards and to certify against those standards. And the engine oil and API's engine oil standards and our certification programs are a natural part of that. To make it very easy to understand the certifications that I have to be concerned about, and to make it clear what kind of certifications we're talking about, it's fairly simple. The slide in front of you now shows the marks that API has established and that we use to help identify oils that meet our standards and are licensed against our standards. So the four marks that you see on the left, we're going to be spending our time talking about those. The API starburst in the upper left is for gasoline engine oils. The one at the bottom is sort of the generic one to indicate how the API donut would look. The two in the middle are the ones we're going to be spending most of our time talking about today, and I'll go into some more detail about the one in the bottom, the API FA-4 donut, because you can see that that's a bit different. Under the API's engine oil program, we also manage and run a program called Motor Oil Matters. That is where we license oil change locations and distributors. And then, as Becky mentioned in the introductory material, we also license diesel exhaust fluid that is now a much more integral part of diesel engine operation. So people understand the scale of our licensing program. I always like to make sure people know what the numbers and the market presence of the API engine oil licensing program. We're currently at 721 licensed oil marketers. That's in 59 countries, and it represents something greater than 15,000 licensed products. We also have 83 licensed diesel exhaust fluid marketers in 6 countries, and that represents about 140 licensed products. Before we get into talking about the new categories, I think I want to make sure people understand when we talk about API performance standards and the licensing programs that we maintain, I always try to make sure people understand how the categories that we currently maintain, which ones are licensable, and essentially so they understand the relationship between the gasoline and diesel oil standards. On the screen in front of you now is our current gasoline categories, or our gasoline engine oil standards. The API S categories, so the gasoline engine oil categories, S stands for service, in case people are curious. There's actually 4 standards that are currently in effect. The oldest is SJ, SL, SM, and SN, and these are in effect largely because the testing that we use, the testing that is used to validate their performance is still available. And there is some desire to keep older categories, particularly when we're talking about products that are being offered and manufactured outside the United States. The S categories are, in essence, for gasoline engine oils, are in essence the umbrella standard. If you were to say for all gasoline engine oils, which category would they be eligible for? They'd be eligible for the SJ, SL, SM, or SN. And the SN is the most current. It was introduced in October 2010. And you would say that that is essentially the umbrella standard. So if you had a gasoline engine oil that you wanted to license, you would be licensed for API SN, and you would be eligible to use the API donut. Above the S categories that you see listed is the ILSEC standards. The ILSEC standards are, in essence, a subset of the gasoline engine oil standards. It applies to a smaller number of viscosity grades. It would be 020, 030, 520, 530, and 1030 engine oils. And these are the categories that are largely recommended by engine manufacturers, North American and Japanese engine manufacturers. So API licenses oils against the GF5 standard as well, but you need to understand that it is a subset of the SN standard. The other thing to keep in mind is the ILSEC standards. There's only one in effect at any one time. The most current one is the only one in effect, and oils that are licensed against the ILSEC standard can use the API starburst that I showed you on the previous slide. The diesel categories aren't quite as complicated as the gasoline engine oil categories, except, of course, when I start explaining the new FA-4 standard. But currently, there are 3 diesel categories. Much like gasoline engine oils, we do keep some of the older diesel categories available. The oldest, CH-4, is still licensable. It was introduced in 1998, then CI-4 and CJ-4. And CJ-4 has been around really since 2006. So it's about a 10-year-old category, and so we're going to go into some detail about the CJ-4 and why we had to introduce the new CK-4 and FA-4 categories. So let's talk about the need for new diesel engine oil standards. As I mentioned earlier, diesel engines, the API CJ-4 standard has actually been around since 2006. And if you look on the roads today, it's pretty obvious that diesel engines have changed quite a bit since CJ-4 was introduced in 2006. Today's engines are more fuel efficient, they have increased power, and they have different hardware. Among the changes, increased use of high-pressure common rail injection systems have been introduced to improve combustion efficiency. There's increased use of advanced turbocharger technology to achieve more power output. And then over the time since CJ-4 has been introduced, there's been a decreased emissions of harmful oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter by exhaust gas recirculation and after treatment devices such as diesel particulate filters and selective catalytic reduction, or SCR. So CJ-4 has been around a fair amount of time, but as I mentioned, hardware has changed, so it was time to start looking at about changing the category so that it can meet the more urgent needs of the newer engines that are coming or on the road or are about to come on the road. Now, there are other drivers for why we had to come up with a new diesel engine oil standards. These largely relate to new emissions regulations, and in fact, emissions regulations has really driven change to diesel engines for decades. So it's no surprise that this process continues. There are new EPA and National Highway Transportation Safety Administration emission legislation for diesel-powered commercial transport vehicles that take effect in 2017, and these do require significant improvements in fuel consumption to help reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And then fuel consumption improvements cover different vehicle classes, types, and sizes. And as it says here, require specific improvements for medium and heavy-duty engines. So new technology, some more stringent emissions regulations. These are two of the reasons why we had to start looking at upgrading the upgrading from CJ-4. And then there was another driver, lower viscosity oils. There is a long-standing belief that using lower viscosity oils helps increase fuel economy. If you increase fuel economy, you help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. if you're using less fuel, you're producing less greenhouse gas emissions. It's fairly simple. And then reduction in the CO2 output is a result of running the, you also get reduction in CO2 output because if you're running the engine more efficiently. And remember I said that the engines are being optimized to run more efficiently. So we have these reasons for doing it. And to talk a little bit more about an improvement of fuel economy, there is a citation from the Fuel Efficiency Confidence Report that said that Class 8 over-the-road fleets can realistically expect fuel savings in the range, say, of 0.5% to 1.5% by switching from 1540 to a 5W or 10W30 engine oil, either a CJ-4 or CK-4. The savings from switching to the fuel-efficient FA-4 variant available after December 2016 can be expected to add a further 0.4 to 0.7% of increased fuel efficiency. So again, this goes back to the statement on the previous slide that said if you use a lower viscosity oil, you can, the belief is, or you can expect to see a fuel efficiency improvement. So when we talk about why we do it, why do we have to change the engine oil? It's for a variety of reasons: to meet the demands of the new engines, to meet emissions requirements, and to give engine manufacturers the opportunity to use some oils that might help them meet these more stringent requirements, which largely relate to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, and by the way, they want all of that to happen and then still provide either the same or improved engine protection. So we had to embark on a way. We had to develop something that would be able to do that and to be able to meet the needs of the trucks that are coming on the road. So what did we end up with? Well, we ended up with something called CK-4 and FA-4, and we're going to talk about both. To the most specific information about, we'll try to get into a little bit about that. But what you need to understand at the moment is CK-4 and FA-4 was developed over a series of years. These things do not take, they don't get done overnight. I wish I could say that they did, but they do take some time. But we have, it did finally get developed. They were approved by the American Society of Testing and Materials in December 2015, and API, the American Petroleum Institute, approved them February 2016. You may have heard in press and in print and in discussions the term PC11 A and B. PC11 stands for proposed category. That's what we would have called it when we would have called the categories when they were being developed. Once they were approved, they've been named are eligible to start displaying CK-4 and FA-4 brands on December 1st, not before that date. That doesn't mean that someone might not slip up and there may be a product on the shelf before December 1st, but officially they're not supposed to be appearing on shelves until that date. They're not allowed to use the API. They're not allowed to use the new categories in the API marks before that date, but they can claim on their packaging that they meet the new standard. They just can't put it in the API donut. API CK-4, the simplest way to describe it is the direct upgrade to CJ-4. It is for high-speed 4-stroke cycle diesel engines designed to meet the 2017 model year on highway and Tier 4 non-road exhaust emission standards. And it's for use in applications with diesel fuels ranging in sulfur content up to 500 parts per million. So the best way to describe CK-4 is it's the natural upgrade to CJ-4. And CK-4 is going to provide the kind of protection that you've come to expect from API performance standards. You're going to get enhanced protection against oil oxidation, viscosity loss due to shear, and oil aeration, as well as protection against catalyst poisoning, particulate filter blocking engine wear, piston deposits, degradation of low and high temperature properties, and related viscosity increase. So in a nutshell, you're going to get the engine protection that you were getting from CJ-4. You're just going to get it in this improved oil. CK-4 is what we would call the backward compatible oil. So if you have users that are using, if you have owner-operators, fleets that are using CJ-4, our expectation is that they will likely be recommended to start using CK-4. And in fact, quite frankly, it's an improved oil, so there's probably no reason why they shouldn't consider using it. To make things simple, since CK-4 is the natural upgrade to CJ-4, it will carry the API donut as you see here. It is what I now call the plain donut for CK-4. It's no different than if this was a gasoline engine oil standard and if it was CJ-4. This is the type of donut that you would have seen with those categories, and we decided that we wanted to make sure that the transition is seamless as possible. So we've opted to use this donut to represent the CK-4 since it's the backward compatible oil. Now let's talk a little bit about FA-4. So again, CK-4 is the natural upgrade to CJ-4. It should be fairly easy to identify them in the market because they're going to carry the API donut as people have expected to see over the last few years, or over many years, over the last 20-some years. Now, FA-4 is a little different. FA-4 is something that when the engine manufacturers had proposed these new categories, this presented us with some concerns because we realized that this was going to be a bit different. We realized we had to handle it carefully because, as you're about to see, FA-4, while CK-4 is what we would call a backward compatible oil, where if you're using CJ-4, you should be able to use CK-4. FA-4 isn't quite that simple. FA-4 is not considered a backward compatible oil, so we realized that maybe we needed to treat this a little bit differently. The specifics about FA-4, it essentially applies to certain XW30 oils, and what that means is 10W30, 5W30, 0W30. There's no 40 weights. There's no any other vis grades related to this. It is strictly 10W30, 5W30, 0W30 oils that would be eligible to qualify for this. And it is formulated for use in select high-speed four-stroke cycle diesel engines designed to meet 2017 model year on-highway greenhouse gas emission standards. Now, I realize that sounds very much like what we just read for CK-4. The difference is this applies to very specific viscosity grades. The other thing that is very different about it, it is for use in on-highway applications with diesel fuel sulfur content up to 15 parts per million, but it's blended to a high temperature, high shear viscosity range of 2.9 to 3.2 centipoise, and with the intent that it's to assist in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what makes FA-4 different is the viscosity. Probably the simplest way to put this is a 10W30 FA-4 and a 10W30 CK-4 are not the same viscosity grade. CK-4 has to meet a higher high temp, high shear requirement than the FA-4. So in essence, you're talking about two different viscosities for diesel oils. And that's one of the reasons why there's a little more care about how FA-4 is going to be managed and how it's going to be portrayed in the marketplace, and one of the reasons why we're spending time trying to make sure that that any engine operators or any fleet operators, owner operators understand that they need to be sure that FA-4 is recommended for their equipment. Now, FA-4 was introduced partly to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it's, as it says here, effective at sustaining emission control system durability where particulate filters and other advanced aftertreatment systems are used. Now, in case you're wondering, FA-4 still has to meet the same battery of requirements that CK-4 has to meet. The main difference is FA-4 has got a different viscosity, and that difference is important, particularly in certain applications where the traditional 10W30 viscosity is necessary. So if you have an engine that is expecting the 10W30 that CJ-4 had provided, then CK-4 is going to be the obvious choice for them. If there's an engine that's tuned and designed to make use of and take full advantage of the benefits of FA-4 and the lower viscosity, then our recommendation is that you would use the FA-4 in that engine. The other thing we point out, FA-4 is not backward compatible with CK-4, CJ-4, or the earlier categories. CK-4 is the backward compatible oil, FA-4 is not. So we keep reminding people that one of the reasons we're doing this webinar is to make sure that diesel owners, owner-operators, fleet operators understand they need to check with their owner's manual or their engine manufacturers to make sure that they're whether they should be using FA-4 or not. Now, remember, we said FA-4 is different, so we also wanted to make sure that it was easy to recognize whether a product that meets FA-4 and that's been licensed for FA-4. We would hope that the designation FA-4 might give someone pause before they bought an oil that maybe isn't right for their diesel engine, but to help prevent misapplication, we also made a change to the API donut. This particular donut, as you see, is unique to FA-4. None of the other categories are going to be using this mark, and it is somewhat different. Remember, the old donut, or what I consider the plain donut, has API service and then the category. Here, we've decided to transpose them. FA-4 is in the upper left quadrant, API service in the right. We get this question asked often. There is not a specific color requirement, but there is a requirement that the FA-4 donut appears as you see it. In other words, that the upper left quadrant must be shaded in some fashion. The belief is that if we make it look different enough, perhaps it will hopefully help prevent misapplication. Because again, FA-4 is supposed to be used only where it's recommended. For those who are interested, there's a fairly rigorous amount of tests that go into API engine oil categories. This particular slide that you see in front of you happens to list the engine tests that are required. Currently, there are Mack, Caterpillar, Mack or Volvo powertrain, Caterpillar, and Cummins engines that are used to validate the performance of CK-4 and FA-4. Both the categories have to meet the same requirements. If you look at the current standard, the main difference is the viscosity, and you can see it at the very top. If you can see at the top of the table that's appearing on the screen now, you see the difference between CK-4 and FA-4. FA-4 has to be somewhere between 2.9 and 3.2 centipoise, and for XW30 oils. An XW30 oil for a CK-4 would have to be a minimum of 3.5 centipoise. So the oils are different, and that's the main reason why we have to make sure that they're properly distinguished as different in the marketplace. So as far as CK-4 and FA-4 specifications go, we are trying, as this presentation that we're doing here and in other venues and in other opportunities, we're trying to get out the word, getting out some words on some guidance on what users of these oils need to know. We're trying to get the guidance out. So we're generally telling people that most truck manufacturers that are recommending CJ4 engine oils will likely recommend CK-4 oils to better protect their diesel engines. We want to make sure people understand FA-4 oils have been designed to protect diesel engines that are expected to be introduced in 2017, but I will tell you that some OEMs may recommend it for other engines that are on the road today. When in doubt, the best recommendation is talk to your engine manufacturer. But many, we believe, are going to recommend that you use CK-4 in place of CJ4 if you've got a truck that's on the road today. We do recommend that technicians, consumers check with the manufacturer to determine the correct oil to use. The new generation of higher performing CK-4 and FA-4 or diesel engine oils will provide engine manufacturers with the protection they need as they create their cleaner and more fuel efficient engines. Now, the other thing that we need to make sure that people understand, as I said, we have these new categories. So we've taken the steps of doing things like these webinars, and we've also launched a campaign that will try to get the word out on CK-4 and FA-4, the advantages of those, the benefits of those, but then partly to make sure that there's no confusion. That if you're recommended to use CK-4, we want to make sure that you can find those. And the same is true for FA-4. So We've done a number of things. The first thing that we did, we launched, as far as our campaign goes, we launched a web presence. We realized we had to get something out into onto the internet to make sure that people at least have some resource to turn to. So if you were to go today to dieselmatters.com, you'd find this level of information. And the key here is to make sure that people understand what CK-4 and FA-4 means. We also are heavily into social media. We've learned quickly that the on-road diesel community does engage on social media. It seems to have been quite effective for us. So we do have Facebook and Twitter. Do have Facebook and Twitter pages out because we want to make sure that we get the information out to consumers. So this is just an example of some of the posts that you're going to see on our social media page, on our Facebook social media. There's Twitter. We find that we have to do this to engage because, again, the key thing that we're trying to make sure people understand is that there's new categories that are out, and you need to understand how those new categories are going to apply to the trucks on the road today and the trucks that are coming down the road. So, questions. I realize I went through that rather quickly because I'd hoped that if there are some questions that we could try to capture those.
All right, well, thank you, Kevin, for that valuable information. I know we do have a few questions here, so we'll just launch right into the Q&A portion of the webinar. The first question that we received was, when will engine manufacturers determine if their new engines will use CK-4 or FA-4?
Well, my understanding is they're beginning to do that now. I have heard discussions that some are saying they're already identifying engines that would use FA-4. They're probably going to have to get that information out within the next, well, certainly within the next 2 months. CK-4 and FA-4 will start hitting the shelves on December 1st, and you want to be sure that that owner-operators, truck drivers, anyone that's operating a diesel engine at least understands what they're looking at because those products will start to appear on the shelf. We want to make sure there's not misapplication. So if they haven't done it already, they're going to have to start doing it within the next 2 months because December 1st, folks, December 1st is going to be around the corner. So while you're thinking about doing your Christmas shopping, you better start thinking about whether those new oils are going to show up on the shelves.
Okay, great. I know in your presentation as well you mentioned how the CK-4 oils were essentially the upgrade from CJ-4. Can those two oils be mixed?
No, they can't. There's certain guidance with any API licensed oil. The rule of thumb is an API licensed oil that's the same vis grade and the same performance level. So in this case, let's just say API CJ4 15W40. If you have two licensed oils, those can be mixed. We're not necessarily recommending you do that, but they can be because there's a requirement that an API licensed oil has to be homogeneous and miscible. In other words, they have to be able to mix and not see reduced performance. But again, remember I said they have to be the same vis grade and the same performance level. If you were to mix a CK-4 and FA-4, you're mixing two different viscosity grades and two different performance levels. So it goes against our guidance and it goes against the standards requirements. So the short answer is no, don't mix them.
Okay. Kind of along that same line of just a little bit, why are the CK-4 oils better than the CJ-4 oils?
Well, it's pretty much follows tradition. When we develop a new standard, you develop new tests generally to accompany that standard. The tests are more representative. In this case, these are fired engine tests that are in stands in test lab cells that run for well, some of them 500 hours. They're designed. These tests are intended to be consistent with the engines that are on the road. And as you can imagine, engines evolve over time. So you put new engines in place, you put new limits in place, and the thing that's always occurred with API categories is the newer category always has more stringent requirements than the previous one. So if the oils can survive the newest tests, it's a good indication that the newest oils at the newest performance levels are an improvement over the previous ones.
Okay. Can you expound a little bit as well on how the new engine oils were tested?
Well, the new engine oils have to go through again a battery of tests. One of the slides in the presentation deck showed the list of tests that have to be run. So in order for an oil to qualify for API licensing, an oil marketer has to subject their oils to those tests. It is a fairly long process. It seems like with every new category, we just keep adding tests. We probably should. One might question why we do that, but I guess there is a need for it. But essentially, for an oil marketer to qualify for a new category, they have to subject their oils to these tests. Assuming that the oils pass, then they can apply for licensing, and they're qualified for licensing under the API standard. So they undergo a lot of testing before they get licensed.
Okay. We also have a question here that says, will the FA-4 oils provide the same engine protection as CK-4?
Yes, they have to meet the same. The tests are no different. The limits are no different. The main difference is it's a different viscosity oil, and depending on the engine manufacturer. Remember, engine oils provide. They don't just protect the engine. Engine oils do provide other functions within that engine, among them hydraulic function. So valves and lifters are depending on certain viscosities, the viscosity that's recommended for the engine. So in order for the engine to run optimally, it's designed with a particular type of oil in mind. So that said, the FA-4 oil will provide the level of protection that the engine manufacturer expects, but the engine manufacturer is the one to recommend whether the FA-4 oil is suitable for that engine, largely because the viscosity grade is different. So the short answer is it's got to meet the same requirements, but because it's a different viscosity grade, the engine manufacturer is the one that's best understands the appetite of that engine and whether FA-4 and the viscosity that FA-4 represents is suitable for that engine.
Okay. We also have one more question here. When will the engine manufacturers be required to factory fill with CK-4 or FA-4?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'll have to find out about that one. That I don't know. I know that they have to work with the EPA on getting their engines certified, but the question when factory fill is required, that I don't know. I can try to follow up and see if I can't get an answer for that, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
Okay. Well, that was the only last question that we had there. So unless there's anything else that you can think of, any points that came to mind that you want to be sure you address with the audience, then we will be able to go ahead and close out.
Well, the only thing I would tell you is you're, as I mentioned rather briefly, we are running a campaign. So this webinar is one example of that. I would encourage anyone that has questions. They certainly feel free to reach out to me, and my contact information is showing on the screen now. I would also encourage them to go to dieseloilmatters.com. They may also to get further information. They may also want to go and link up with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We would hope that we can provide a little bit of entertainment while we're also providing education. So this is something we're going to continue for a good while. December 1st is first licensing date, so we're not going to stop everything on December 2nd. We're going to have to keep this going, partly because the new categories are out. We want to make sure that there's no confusion, and we also want to make sure that fleet operators, owner-operators, that they all understand that these oils are coming out, and they need to be careful about which ones they're using, and they need to be sure that they're using the right ones. The other thing that they may have to get used to is that they could, particularly for fleets, they could be in a situation where they have to maintain two oils, where they were accustomed perhaps to only having to carry a particular visgrade CK-4 product. They may, as they bring in newer engines, they may have to get used to the idea that they're going to have two oils, and they have to get used to the idea they can't mix them, and they can't just be interchanged. You need to make sure that the engines get the oils that are recommended for them.
Okay, great. And with that contact information on the screen, I just want to let the question asker who was asking about when the engine manufacturers would be required to factory fill with CK-4 or FA-4. I'm sure that Kevin wouldn't mind you emailing him your question, and then he will be able to answer that for you. I know I just got a question as well asking when would the PowerPoint be on the API website. Kevin, do you know when that might be?
We'll make sure that gets taken care of quickly.
Great. I know we also are recording today's session, so the recording of this webinar with the PowerPoint as well will be made available on www.ccjwebinars.com. So you will be able to view the webinar again there or send it to someone else in your company. And then, of course, we will have that website updated with future webinars as they arise. At this time, if there's nothing else, I just want to thank you again, Kevin, for your valuable insight and the information you shared this afternoon. We certainly want to thank you as well, our listeners, for attending today's webinar, and we hope that you've gained innovative information on running your business more effectively. We also thoroughly appreciate API for making this webinar possible. Again, if you have any questions for the speaker that we were unable to address during the program or that you were unable to ask, you can send them either to Kevin with his information that's on the screen, or you can send them to me by replying to the email you received from GoToWebinar with today's login information. Otherwise, be sure to check back to www.ccjwebinars.com for the recording and for future webinar information. Thank you again, and have a great day.